Hello, everybody. I'm excited to welcome Jenn Zahrt, who I've known like through many lives, it feels like so far. Jen was part of a duo that published my annotated version of Lily's autobiography of his history, his life and times. And we've worked together on a number of publications since, and it's just been so exciting to see what Jen has been up to. And without stealing any thunder, there's been some really exciting developments coming out of Olympia and Jen's press revelure. So I know that she'll tell you more about those. Jen came forward with two really excellent ideas about what to present for this conference, and I'm telling you guys, I really struggled to figure out which one was the one to put forward, so I flipped a coin.
That's how
And
you did.
yeah, I thought they were both perfect. I didn't know what to do, so I just kind of flipped a coin, and so here we go. And we'll get the other one out there at some point in the future. Jen, I'm really excited that you're here. Thank you so much for spending part of your weekend with us, and I'll go ahead and give you the mic.
All right, thank you, Wade. So today we're going to talk about a history of the future, and namely through the lens of one of Germany's most prominent and successful mundane astrologers who also happened to be a woman. And what we're going to see is she lived through three different major regimes in the German world, and that gives us an insight into the shifting currents politically through the lens of a political astrologer. And so we're going to start from the beginning with her childhood, get a little bit of the lay of the land of who she was working around. You can see this is sort of a photo of her youth and then her middle age. She went to an astrology conference or two in her time. And then the last photo you see there is the last photo taken on her birthday, the year that she died. So this is going to be more of a history per se, as opposed to like a tactical, mundane astrological experience. And I also want to name, if you see there, the Sophia Centre for the MA in Cultural Astronomy and Astrology is where I began this research. And I want to thank them for their support at the University of Wales and Nicholas Campion. Because this is one of the things that happens when you go there. So if you enjoy this and you want to be more like this and do research like this, please think about adding that to one of your academic credentials. So Elsbeth Ebertin was born in Görlitz, Germany on the 14th of May, 1880, in the evening of about around 6 p.m., 6:22 and 22 seconds, so she rectified. And you'll notice here on her chart, she's drawing special things like Regulus on her midheaven. So I just want to flag that for you. She's got Scorpio rising with Mars in Cancer conjunct the moon in the ninth house. And this is a photo of her as a small child. And as she was growing up, her parents were tailors and they used to make costumes for people. And so this is immersing their children. They had six children. Not all of them made it to adulthood, but they would create so many different costumes for the plays and festivals that she spent her entire childhood growing up with this kind of cultural history around her. And she would try on different outfits and go to the plays and the theater pieces. And as a little girl, she began to collect birthdays and death days. And the reason why it was more about this idea of thinking about these cultural hit figures, wanting to read the novels that were based on the plays that she was seeing, and really like living in this immersive world of the theater coming to life before her eyes. And this is important to note because this becomes a critical moment in the development of how she does her astrology. So before she's even heard of astrology or any divination system, she's already got this vast collection of birthdays and death days from her readings. And at this time, she wasn't somebody who was going to go to university. She ended up having her father die when she was 13. And as the oldest child, you'll see here, she's the one in the nice Napoleon hat, dressed up as a little boy. She was ending up having to help her mom with the household, and this became very tedious for her. So at the age of 17, she left home and was simultaneously got her first article published, which was on the 100th birthday anniversary of one of the cultural figures that she was looking at. And she noticed that this was successful. And she thought, oh, wow, this collection of birthdays that I have means that I can actually get published. So if I write my little documents about these people and try to submit them for publication at the right time. This is also a pro tip for everybody listening. Like, this is a good strategy. It's culturally relevant for the newspaper to celebrate the anniversary of this person, so my article will get chosen. So this becomes one of her tactics. Now, around 1900, and another way she leaves the house is this man here is Reinhold Ebertin's father, and that's a picture of Reinhold Ebertin in 1911. So she ends up getting married to a man 10 years her senior who's an insurance calculator. And that's kind of boring to her. And so in 1901, Reinhold Ebertin is born. In 1903, she has a second child who does not make it past 6 months old. And in 1906, she gets divorced from this man and gives up custody of her son and begins to enter a world where she's dependent upon publishing for her livelihood. She's a single woman, no education officially, besides high school. And now she's divorced. And this is a lot of things that are like adding up to being problematic in this world. And she's given up custody of her child. So she ends up using this strategy of birthdays, death days, and the added ingredient of in 1900 she gets interested in graphology and she begins to publish publicly about graphology and becomes well known for this in the course of the next decade. So in 1910, she enters the field of astrology. And this slide is showing us the various groups of astrologers that were active in early 20th century Germany. We have theosophical astrologers like Hugo Vollrath, who was a publisher, Karl Brandler Pracht. We have scientific-based astrologers going forward, developing into, we want to test astrology statistically. We have the development of a strand of psychological astrologers. We have the researching Hamburg School, founded by Alfred Witte and Sigrun. And then we have academics who were studying astrology, like Abby Warburg, Walter Benjamin, and so others. So if you want to read more about this, send me an email after this. I can send you the master's thesis I wrote for the Sophia Centre that actually goes into depth who all these people were. Elsbeth slotted herself in a way with the more research-based people, and she was a popularizer of astrology. And she was also on the outside of the community because of her controversial status. So the war breaks out in Europe in 1914, the Great War. And at this point, around that time, the authorities outlaw astrology. And she has to pivot hard because now, as a single woman whose child is not in her possession, who's divorced, who doesn't have an official education, can't make money doing fortune telling anymore. So in 1910, when she had met one of the Hamburg School astrologers, she realized that she could do astrology not for personal reasons, but of fates of nations and peoples. And if she directed her attention at mundane astrology, she couldn't be accused of telling fortunes. So this became one of the main things that she began to pivot towards. And she got herself some books from the Theosophical published Astrologische Bibliothek from Karl Brandler Pracht was her first textbook. This is very theosophically inflected, gives her a sense of that sort of early modern astrology coming over from the United Kingdom. And then she ends up pivoting in the middle of 1915. She gets the first copy of this translated book by C.A.Q. Libra, or Rolf Takens, a Dutchman. And she ends up improving her astrology because this man's astrology is not necessarily interested in some of the theosophical strands. He actually wants to take it to that more scientific level, including, there's an interesting fact that I learned when I was doing some of research in the translations of this work. In the German versions, there's this nice fat paragraph about converse secondary progressions, and in the English version, it doesn't appear anywhere. So make sure you pay attention when you are looking at primary sources, what is and is not translated. Speaking of translations, Elsbeth in 1915 realizes that all of these pamphlets she's been producing during the war about mundane astrology are disappearing because they're either getting banned, burned, or sold out. So she says, you know what, we need to keep this together. I'm going to produce my first book. So her first book about astrology is called Royal Nativities. It comes out in 1915, and I just translated this into English last year, and so you can read it eventually. And what she's done is she's taken the charts of all of the world leaders involved in the conflict in the First World War, and she's analyzed them to see if she can predict what's going to happen in the war. And we're going to look at some of these charts now. So the first one that she really needs to study is obviously the emperor of her own kingdom, which is Kaiser Wilhelm II. So she's looking at these two charts and she displays, these are the charts that are actually in the book, and she's showing his horoscope with all of her favorite chart factors, and she's also showing the solar return for the year in order to predict what's going to happen at that moment. And one of the things she wants to draw people's attention to is that transit Saturn is opposing the sun in this person's chart, and that transit Saturn is also making some moves to harm this individual, which then also means harm to the state, right? So we have Saturn on the natal Saturn opposing the sun in concert with the natal Saturn-Sun opposition, which is already an indicator that this is going to be problematic. She also reads the charts of King George V, Kaiser Joseph, Franz Joseph I, the French president Raymond Poincaré, and King Albert I of Belgium, not shown here. So you can see these chart wheels, the way that she's drawing them by hand into the typescript, and all of these photos are the photos that were included in her manuscript. The one that makes her famous, though, is the delineation of the horoscope of Tsar Nicholas II. Sorry, that should say 1868 right there. So she's born on 18th of May, 1868, in the middle of the day, and she's got his chart drawn here with a lot of fixed stars in it. And she's also seen like different parts. You see the little heart in the third house is one of the Arabic parts. And she's working at this point in 1915 with pretty much everything she's getting out of the Theosophical Astrological Library that she's got. And two of the points that really stand out, which I'm going to show you in the next slide, are Neptune in the eighth and the sun conjunct the Pleiades. So she says, the sun in conjunct with Pleiades has, according to this library that I'm reading, a very evil effect. This constellation often brings violent death by blows, stabbing, or a killer, violent fates and accidents. However, the position of Jupiter in the eighth is softening and protective so that many attempted assassinations can still fail and many a serious danger delayed. The position of Neptune in the eighth indicates a difficult or enigmatic death, which, because Neptune was in Aries, can also take place in an unconscious state because Aries rules the head. If the Tsar can get beyond some very critical times in the next 3 years and reach an advanced age, then he is in danger of losing his sight one day. The Tsar died on July 7th, 1918. This was published in 1915. Everybody read her words in this, which are not actually conclusive. If you really look at it, she goes, if he can get beyond critical times in 3 years, then he's in danger of losing sight. But he didn't. And the word 3 years here is the critical piece. So she becomes very well known at this point for having predicted the negativity that would befall this Tsar. And at this time, she continues to get detained. Her works continue to get censored. Even into 1917, she wrote an article about Hindenburg that was censored. And what she says is they kept trying to prohibit her from publishing her newsletter, and she kept convincing them that mundane astrology had nothing to do with telling horoscopes for people about their future, the things that were being outlawed. She goes, because she'd already looked into like she would use these things about like, Goethe used astrology. All of these world historical figures were using astrology. How can you outlaw this cultural heritage? I'm just making a pathway to transmit that into the future. I'm not telling horoscopes. I'm not predicting people's fates, which is a little bit ironic. But she also says this. She goes, she had seen in 1919, she writes in one of her almanacs, she had seen a passage in Firmicus Maternus that says, if you have Regulus conjunct the midheaven, you'll become an astrologer to kings and you'll transmit the divine teachings. And she's like, this is an ancient claim. Like, how is that going to apply to me? I'm living here in, in 1919. How is Firmicus Maternus in the year 400 telling me what I'm going to do, And she goes, okay, I'm just going to test this and I'm going to write about kings and queens. So she wrote about this a long time before, like this was a realization she's reporting in 1919 that she had already had in 1914, which is why she went to mundane astrology first as well, because it wasn't as personal. Because she could talk about the fates of kings and queens and as being responsible for the fate of the country and what's going to happen next, then she wasn't drilling down to that personal, like as we know that astrology personal level, like the natal chart of an individual just for the individual's fate. So her view was always out towards this greater good. Just so happens that because she started doing this, she realizes that once she put graphology aside due to its being outlawed and she dedicated herself to royal charts, it actually put her in indirect and eventually direct contact with kings. King Ferdinand of Bulgaria became one of her best friends. And in the time that she was publishing her almanac, Ein Blick in die Zukunft, which is what these little pamphlets started to become, and I'll show you that in the next slide, she becomes one of his friends and lives in the same town as him for 3 years. And at some point during their friendship, he gives her a ring. And this is important. So you'll also note her logo for the press she founds at some point later in her life, called the Regulus Verlag, so the Regulus Press, is named after the conjunction of Regulus in her midheaven. And also you'll see there's a scorpion in the logo, and there's also a Mars-Uranus conjunction with the star at the top of the chart inside the logo that matches her natal chart as shown here. So she's got this cohesive emphasis on, hey, I've got Regulus on my midheaven. I'm going to take this to 60, 0 to 60. So in the war during this time, because of her mundane predictions, she ends up creating an almanac. I don't have personal copies of 1918 or 1919, but most of the works that you're seeing here are actually the copies that are available at Cayley, which is where I'm sitting right now, which is a research library for astrology. So in 1920, she prints anonymously the King of Ferdinand's chart here. You'll see she says an exceptional horoscope. She doesn't name him. She just gives the birthday and she says, "Hey, everybody who doesn't know what real astrology looks like, check this out. Here's a real chart you can look at." And she's pointing out with this aspect that's drawn inside the houses, a huge square between Uranus, Saturn, and the Sun. She delineates that. She goes on to publish again the next year and the next. And so we start to see all of these things come together in her works with political expressions. And as her works get more popular, she gets to a readership of about 8,000 by the time we get to the 1922 edition. She starts to say that, she's very upset with having to be contacted so much. It's almost like her success starts to bite her because people want her to do their personal horoscopes. And she goes, "No, I'm making almanacs for everyone. I want to reach a wider group of people. And my intention isn't to tell you your future, it's to help you understand how real astrology works." And so these are somewhat mundane predictions for Germany and different people in different categories, like different sun sign categories, but they're also meant to be educational. And as she proceeds, each edition has educational material in the beginning, teaching somebody some facet of astrology. So you actually get more than just what's ahead for the year. You're going to get a mini lesson on what astrology is about. And she also reveals that in these three editions, there are sections where she says, "I couldn't actually publish during the war and even after the war some of the things that I really wanted to say because I would get censored and these works would get confiscated. So if I say anything negative about Germany, I run the risk of having trouble, even if the stars say there's something negative going to happen. So I have to be very careful with what I actually can print because otherwise I'm going to get in trouble." And she doesn't want to have that happen. She also noted that after the war, she wanted to have printed this. The retreat of the Kaiser Wilhelm II took place exactly when Saturn, Neptune, and Uranus made challenging aspects to her chart, but she felt afraid publishing that during the war. So now that her readership has reached 8,000, she starts to add a series of mundane works that forms the core of her mundane experience. And you can see here up to this point, this is 1921, a full page ad for all of the works in print that she has right now about astrology. Walter Rathenau was a German figure who was assassinated on the 24th of June, 1922. And 6 days after this, Elsbeth prints two different articles in a newspaper that she thinks are so important, she turns them into a book. And in this book, it's got 4 sections, and 2 of the sections are educational on how to become a mundane astrologer and predict these yourself. To answer the question of can assassinations be prevented, she goes, "Yeah, it depends. There's no actual conclusive answer to that. But she does say, become a better mundane astrologer and see for yourself." So that's really her point with that work. In this one, also, I've translated into English so you can check out the specific predictions and a lot more details about what's going on in German history at that time. But the success of this work was built on the fact that she had successfully predicted Tsar Nicholas III's, Nicholas II's death and the way that he died mysteriously, as well as her growing readership with the almanacs. Then she produces a textbook of mundane astrology in 1923. And if you'll note, in 1923, Germany was experiencing the beginning of the most extreme hyperinflation in the 20th century, if not ever. And so she was not able to publish her almanac in this year. And because this is a work about mundane astrology first and foremost, it also serves as her almanac. At the end, she adds these predictive paragraphs about what's going to happen in the year ahead. It's less comprehensive as her normal work, but the cost of paper at this point is so astronomically high, she simply has to hold back. So let's look into this one a little bit. Pardon me. So in this work, she's detailing again the self-censorship that she had to experience during the wartime, and she's also noting that there's specific critical degrees valid for the Hohenzollern family that related how she was predicting the downfall of them and that Germany would not win World War I because of the Hohenzollern family's charts. On this, you'll see a little bit of math, and it's cool to see a typeset letterpress fraction here, 29 1 and a half, 29 1 over 2. And so she's delineating, as you might remember, like what's 29.5? That's the cycle of Saturn. The Hohenzollern family has a recurrent pattern in the family charts of Saturn being conjunct or opposite. And so we have critical degrees of the generational affecting transits of 7, 9, and 25 through 28 fixed. occurring simultaneously in three generations of charts. In the year 1888, when you see this nice long typed word, Drei Kaiserjahr, the first emperor dies. The second emperor, who is very young, also dies. And so the young son, Wilhelm II, ascends to power all within 1 year. And this was critical for the charts of all of them. And so you can see that there's a lot of sort of drilling down into the family's astrology itself, that dynastic astrology that was going to allow her to predict that because of the ruler of the country and their chart factors taking place in terms of determining the ruler of the country's fate, that the Hohenzollern family themselves would have needed to end their relationship or the war or sort of, stopping and being involved in World War I in 1917 before Saturn would make specific moves in Wilhelm II's chart. And she also notes then that another factor here is that Saturn was conjunct the star Regulus, and that was why she predicted the downfall. So she's using fixed stars, Saturn transits to fixed stars, to predict this. And I also want to note that Saturn will be conjunct Regulus again in October of 2036. Furthermore, a little bit later in this work, she discusses that she has a hypothesis that solar flares are important for astrology, which may still be a thing. So she's widening her mundane lens into looking at the effects of solar flares on societies. And this has root in one of her teachers who we're going to meet in a minute. And she also is looking at, this relationship of Saturn and those transits. And also in here is a mini lesson on the history of ancient and medieval astrology with all of the names that you'd expect. So this was already being printed in 1923, right? I think that's important to note is that she knew about Firmicus Maternus, she knew about Dorotheus, she knew about all of these factors. She cites Ptolemy a lot. And so what she's doing is she's still referencing a lot of the things that we reference in the traditional revival because it didn't need to be a revival then. Modern astrology was still only being invented. In 1924, this was her second watershed moment. So this book was published in the middle of 1923, which you can imagine was ravaging the country with the inflationary costs, etc. And she does not show this chart. This chart comes out in 1930. So this is anachronistic, but I wanted to show it to you to flag for you what was about to happen. This is her eventual massive revelation that Hitler was going to be a big figure in Germany. So here in the German, you can see that somebody born at the end of April in 1888 is going to get him into personal danger this year and potentially bring about something that is going to come into motion. Stein ins Rollen. She's going to bring the stone into rolling, going to get the stone rolling. And so then in bold on the very next page, this is important because it's plural, not singular. And it's also unlike her to do this in her texts. In most of these almanacs, there's never anything in bold this way. So this is actually pretty important. She goes, the German populace can only come back to its senses through a few sent by God, spiritual and political leaders, plural, also religious leaders, so that they can get people back in touch with their belief in God and their cosmological sensibilities. And these people are above all politics. And she talks about this. So it's like she's not saying it's Hitler as an individual. She's saying, okay, Germany, and you'll see a little bit further down when you look at the slides later, she's very upset, like many Germans were, about the Versailles Treaty and its unfulfillable, like contents, etc. This was before the Dawes Plan. And she's saying that Germany needs to have people come to their senses through leaders who are actually like probably astrologers, is what she's eventually kind of suggesting here, is that they stand above the parties. And she consistently says this. She's like, I'm not allegiant left or right. I'm an astrologer. I see this from a whole different vantage point that allows me to be above the fray because mortal beings are doing these, ego attachments to this or that. And they can't see that the planets are already showing us the trends. And if we look at those planetary trends, we don't need to be attached to these different political motions here or there, and we can actually make better decisions and prevent the deaths that would have happened between 1917 and 1918 if we had just ended the war successfully prior to that time. But the after Hindenburg had made some kind of successful motion, he didn't want to give up, and so the rest is history, as we say. Nevertheless, going back to the beginning, so then, after this is published, and I'll show you the book where this comes in next, the beer hall putsch is unsuccessful, right? So this individual born, She says it's an Aries, but it turns out that on that day of Hitler's birth, as we know, the sun went from 29 Aries into 0 Taurus, and he was born with 0 Taurus. So she puts the paragraph in the wrong section in her almanac, despite the public error. She says she could see it coming because Saturn was in transit through Hitler's 12th house. And it turns out that on November 8th, 1923, which was the day of the failed putsch, Saturn was at 25 Libra, within a degree of crossing Hitler's ascendant. He was apprehended and jailed for a time, wrote a book, and the rest is also history. Now, this book is what created a massive rift in Elsbeth's relationship with the community because it ended up selling so well, people got jealous of her. And she ends up saying, it's not my fault. I'm having a really good Uranus transit to my midheaven. So she interviews with this man, Ludwig Hoffmann, who becomes a future collaborator on another set of almanacs not shown in this talk, as well as more of these little pamphlets of Sternenwandel und Weltgeschehen. This sold over 14,000 copies in 8 weeks and eventually came to sell 70,000 copies. And she continues in it as she's interviewed to report that she's being censored all the time. She's like, I want to make these really bold predictions, but I'm not able to. So I have to stay at a smaller level because I don't want to get in trouble because there's still this perception that she's going to have her works confiscated if she tells the truth. And in this work, she goes into delineating how she came to her Hitler prediction, what the response to that had been. She tells that she had sent a copy of her pamphlet to the party to get to him to sort of say, like, chill, dude, don't do that in November. And he didn't listen. And so all of this is documented. And you can see, like, she's sort of using this social proof of the interview to let some real talk out that she couldn't claim in her own publications, even though in her own publications, she's still very much bold. So she also says in this on page 16, I'm a cosmologist. I stand above all the political parties, right? She's like, I can't get involved with politics in this way. And she literally says, als Kosmologin, like she sees herself as a cosmologist, which is interesting, not even an astrologer. And then we also see on page 17, she actually sort of revises some of her things saying, okay, well, yes, this individual, Hitler, got in trouble, but keep your eyes on him because even though it looks like the wheel of fate is on a downward trend, as we look forward, it's going to go up again. And I think what she's actually talking about is the movement of Saturn through his chart, even though she does not state that explicitly, which is also to say, in many of her works, she doesn't quite fully tell the public everything about where her mundane predictions are coming from. She flags this or that fact, and then oftentimes she'll cite something else like, I talk more about this in this other book. Oh, I talk more about that in this other book. Go see my almanac for this year. And she's kind of constantly cross-selling. And as someone who's now over the last 14 years collected a lot of her works to do the research, you feel like you're kind of being on a dog chase this whole time, and you don't ever get that full payoff of like, okay, here's the real meat. She's kind of doing that really good salesperson thing of, sending you this or that way to collect all of her books. So because she says, after this 1924 popularity, everybody's coming after her. She's got this fabulous Uranus trine to her midheaven. She goes, you know what? I'm going to create a novel for the first time with the intention of making it a screenplay to popularize astrology, real astrology for the masses in the contents of this novel. And her teacher, Albert Kneipp, who is also the teacher of Alfred Witte, and you'll see from his 2 publication titles here, he was very much interested in doing research-based astrology to figure out how it worked, right? Physics, this kind of idea of testing the things to see if it's an electromagnetic tug or some other kind of potential causal influence. And so he was very research-based and instilled that into her. And he goes, astrology is caviar for the masses. Do not try to popularize astrology. It will never happen. He uses the word nie, never. She goes, yeah, watch me. So this book does get filmed into a work called Marsenhaus of Death becomes in den Sternen stets geschrieben. And unfortunately for this Uranus transit, the film did get filmed. It got premiered. She had a wonderful moment of life. This is a photo of her from that time. And all of the copies were lost in World War II when we bombed them. So that's the story. This is the first time I've actually found evidence of the film ever. And I think it's really funny to look at how grumpy the main character is with her finger on the chart of like, look at this chart. You predicted my husband would die. Anyway, okay. Moving forward to 1926, she found yet another publication called Spiegelbilder unserer Zeit, which is about a sort of astrological journal, somewhat educational, somewhat mundane, very much as you'd expect a kind of like trade journal kind of thing. And in one of these issues, she allows her son to have his first article printed. And so this becomes the beginning of Reinhold Ebertin's career. And there you see the title of it and the texture of the letterpress page. And that was 1926. And so for all the people who love cosmobiology, she kicked him off on that. Now, the work of her almanac continues into actually 1938. And so here we see the copy from 1925. The photo that you see up in the corner of Elsbeth is a pastel drawing made of her that was printed in 1927. And in the 1925 almanac, we learn a lot of things. At this point, she's still very mad at her readership for continuing to flood her with letters about casting their own horoscope. And on page 13, she says, I don't cast horoscopes. If I publicly comment on this or that horoscope of a politician or statesman, I do it in the interest of science, the field of astrology, and to educate those who are excited by astrological research and want to penetrate the spirit of astrology. So she's even doing mundane, not even to like have a way of saying this is what's going to happen. When she has successful predictions, it's because she's trying to say, see, it works, you should learn it too. And she's like, and she also says at this point, I don't want to teach classes on astrology because you can't actually teach interpretation. You either have it or you don't. So she's advocating, like herself, doing self-study so that it's like, okay, if you're really inspired by reading what she's writing, get your ephemeris, go learn how to calculate the charts, and then just go for it yourself, which runs against a lot of the community groups and institutes forming in Germany at that time that say we have to have a bunch of education. She then says in this same work that she's got a change in her political astrology, right? People asked her to produce a new volume of that work that she had made with this guy, the Logo Hoffman, and she decided that she did not want to do that because she was being too flooded at this point after the works of just people wanting her attention, I suppose, yeah. Um, just back to this for a second. With the 1925 one, she also says that, sorry, I lost some notes here. After Germany's defeat, in this evidence, the reason why I'm poking out 1925 specifically here is that in this work, she's also distancing herself from the Nazis at a point because this is about 2 years after her Hitler prediction. The problem here is that the names that she's citing that she's interested in are still nationalists, but they're not the future National Socialists, right? So there are a lot of people who say research into Elsbeth is like you're looking at a Nazi sympathizer, and she's consistently stating her relationship to politics as well as her relationship to what is happening with Hitler's branch of those politics. And so we have to be very careful about accusing her of that. She's definitely a nationalist, but she's not necessarily a National Socialist. So in 1928, she has another conversation in print with Ludwig Hoffmann, and she's already predicting another world war. The very first line here is Der bevorstehende Weltkrieg, as in, hey, look, we just got done with this. Why are we about to do this again? And so this entire pamphlet goes through all of the factors that are going to be predicting that happening. And she also says she's really concerned about the fact that the inflation is happening and it's not getting necessarily better, and that Germany is too dependent on other countries for her to continue making political predictions, right? So she's still doing the almanac in order to satisfy people's interests, but she's not going to necessarily give us political predictions because she can't say for sure what's going to happen because she's not able to look at the whole entire world's political charts, which is sort of an interesting excuse, you might say, right? And so she goes, for me, there's no going back. No, she goes, it would feel like to continue to do mundane astrology, it would feel like going from the tip of a high mountain down to a deep valley. For me, there's no going back, only looking forward, no limits, only the wide view into space and time, into a space free from the domination of political parties and egotism. So then she's actually really sassy. For the 1930 prognosis for Taurus, she name checks Hitler and says the North Node going over the sun promises successful advancement as well as connections to impressive public personalities, honor, renowned, and new international connections. Notable for this will be Adolf Hitler, who will step into the foreground again for a time in September of that year. well after this was printed, he won 6 million votes and joined the German parliament. And the next year, she would publish another book on astrology with a decade-long view called the Himmlische Kursbuch. So this is again, that chart from Hitler appears in this work. In this work, we have on the inside cover, she's responding to a reader request saying, I want you to print Hitler's chart. And she's like, okay, fine, here it is. So it's in full color on the inside cover, a little bit of a blue tint to that ink, alongside another chart for 1931 showing a vote, which is odd because that vote didn't happen. So it's kind of interesting that she's putting something there that isn't something that happened. But in this work from 1930, the orange work is from 1930, and the one behind it is 1934, where she repeats herself. She's, again, with that cross citation. When you read the almanac for 1934, she says, go back and get my work from 1930, where I say, in this year, Jupiter, Mars, and Neptune are in Virgo, which promises a robust harvest, and these will be fruits that rot easily. So as Hitler is now about to get double the amount of votes and enter the German parliament with a mandate, she says, in the countries of the world, right? And so now she's sort of widening her lens actually. She's like, I'm wondering, is this just Germany and the state, or is this the whole world? She goes into this revealing of in this time all of these world crops have now rotted, and people are having to throw coffee in the ocean in Brazil. Oranges are rotting in Spain. And this is coming alongside the sort of bubbling up of Hitler getting a mandate into the German parliament. And she's sort of saying the fruit is rotten. The fruit is rotten. Watch out. It's rotten in the state of Denmark. If we go back here to the 1936 issue, it's 6 years after the discovery of Pluto, and she's talking about the utility of Pluto in the chart. And she says, whenever I see Pluto in early degrees of Gemini, I see shoulder problems. And you'll remember that when Hitler went through the putsch, he ended up hurting his shoulder. And so there's this like returning back to a past prediction to enhance it with new data to see that Pluto was active in Hitler's chart in a way that had an impact on his physical health. And alongside all of this, she was publishing a lot of other things that we'll see in just a minute. But she was doing research into fixed stars still. She was always doing research into medical astrology, and she was using her almanacs and other publications to allow her to have the time freedom to do these things. She also, with her own Saturn in the sixth house, was moving constantly. She was never able to actually settle in one place. She was always on the go, moving to the next place and the next place, never more than 3 years in one city that I can tell, and really covered kind of anywhere you could go in Germany, north, south, east, west, sometimes in Munich, Hamburg, Baden-Baden, etc. So that was another factor. Now, in 1944, this is coming from the autobiography of her son Reinhold, she ends up predicting that she's going to die by suffocation in a military attack. And her son's going, why don't you just leave the city? And she goes, if I leave, then my neighbors will be suspicious and the Gestapo will be suspicious because they all keep saying if Elsbeth Ebertin is still here, then we're safe. And so she ends up staying, and on November 27th, 1944, in Operation Tigerfish, she ends up losing her life with what Reinhold calls a Volltreffer to her apartment and is completely obliterated. And the only thing that they can find left of her body is her glasses and the ring that she was given by King Ferdinand of Bulgaria. And all of her research was gone, and that is the end of her story, sadly. So we see the summary of her techniques that she was doing in a mundane way is that she states and demonstrates she was using eclipses and nodal transits through the signs as they would contact world figures charts. She would also read ingress charts for Germany and in the world, but mostly aimed at Germany, and would talk about the ways that that was going to affect all of the mundane topics that you would expect. She put a heavy emphasis on transit Saturn through charts. And she would then sprinkle in, when relevant, transits of Jupiter, Uranus, and Neptune, and eventually Pluto, sometimes with a dash of Mars. And this is the interesting thing. If she's using any other timing techniques, she doesn't say it in print. And if we go back to her talking about censorship, I think she wasn't really, really ready to give away all the tricks that made her predictions successful. I think she gave people just enough to be like sort of curious, and that she sort of, hey, but get deeper in. You'll be able to kind of learn the rest of it if you're really into it, but she's not going to delineate a specific lineup of, and then I did this, and then I did this, and then I did this. She was a little more revelatory in the early days with her royal nativities, where she does kind of show the whole chart delineation. But as time goes on, she gets a little more, what would you say, like stichpunktig. She just sort of gives you like the top points that are effective there. And she also says, hey, by now I've been publishing these almanacs for 20 years. If you want to learn early stuff, either go get another book or just pick me up from the beginning because I'm not going to repeat myself at this point. So she does have that kind of like, why haven't you been paying attention to me this whole time? And then stop writing me letters about your chart. Very conflictual individual with Mars and Cancer ruling that chart. And finally, I just wanted to run through to show you all of the things that she's written. The ones that I can identify that are mundane are in bold. And this is a very active person. Four periodicals, her almanac, another almanac, the two things that we saw in her the conversations on Mundane with Ludwig Hoffmann, and then that journal that I showed you where her son had his first article. And then she also wrote articles for the periodicals that were present in the German astrological community. And then, if you want more, because I'm at the end of my talk today, I'm developing a Sophia Centre short course on the history of astrology in early 20th century Germany. So what we talked about here will be incorporated in one of the 5 weeks. And then if you would like to pick up my translations of Elsbeth's mundane works, there's Can Assassinations Be Prevented and Royal Nativities, available through Revelor Press. And if you read French, my revised PhD thesis research on Walter Benjamin, a German philosopher, and astrology is out with Editions Vue de l'Esprit in the Francophone world. And that is a distillation of the last 25 years of my thinking around astrology and German culture. And it will eventually come out in English, but right now it's out in French. So thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I loved all the follow-up resources that were presented there at the end. Lots of excited comments coming through right now, so that's great. Okay, yeah, I've got a a copy of Royal Nativities, and I'm 3/4 of the way through. I have such a great time with it. I read a chapter a night. It's a very short read, and it's like very easy to get into, and yeah, very enjoyable. Thanks so much for coming, Jen. It was really wonderful to have you.
Thank you.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, everybody, we will take a 20-minute break and then come back. When we do, we'll welcome Paula to the stage. She's going to be talking about astrology in Brazil for the year ahead.